While watching HBO's new hit show Mare of Easttown, I read a headline about how the costume designer would go to Wawa and take pictures of people to get ideas for the show. In particular, the designer wanted ideas on how to make the costumes unflattering and more like real America. The immediate picture that came to mind when I read this headline was actually pretty funny. I pictured an Edna Mode type figure, which is what I assume all costume designers in Hollywood must look like, hiding behind bags of Cheetos or hiding away in the aisles trying to snap pictures of people in a subtle way. But as I thought about this topic more deeply, it read as a bit elitist to me. As someone living in Pennsylvania, I know we do not dress in the best way, especially compared to standards of the Hollywood elite, but also taking pictures of people at a Wawa run and using that as your basis for the costumes of an entire town is not exactly showing people at their best or also in a fully realistic way. This elitism was later confirmed to me when I read another headline about how the hair and makeup people were told to give the actors bedhead type hair in order to seem also more authentic. I think this idea of elitism matters in this context because I think Hollywood tends to glamorize blue collar towns. And I think this has three noteworthy problems that explain why this elitism is particularly bad. First, I think this glamorization can make it seem that the hard knock life depicted in these towns is something that is desirable, or at the very least, that people get some deeper meaning in their lives as a result of their suffering, when suffering can sometimes just be suffering. Second, I think oftentimes when you have a glamorization, you focus on a few people or group of characters, and as a result, you're not actually depicting the root cause of issues. Things like how people don't have social safety nets, how factories move out of these towns and leave them in economic depression, how these are systemic issues that can be solved on a more broad scale. And lastly, I think that oftentimes when there is a glamorization, that there is also a covering up of the less good parts of these towns. For example, Mayor of Easttown didn't really go into a lot of the racism that can occur in these towns, or other problematic behavior that can be discriminatory. In particular, the elitism surrounding the production of Mare of Easttown led to three problems with the show overall. The first problem is that of costume design. By deciding to make the characters dress in unflattering Wawa clothes virtually all the time, they limit the ability to both actually be realistic and also show character development through the show. In terms of realism, I think this stands out the most in characters like Erin's best friend, who looks like she is wearing pajamas all the time, which is not how an actual teenager would dress. In terms of character development, we see throughout the show that several characters go through periods where they have some sort of emotional breakthrough or spiral into deeper depressions. However, especially for characters who are not Mare, their clothes remain the same. It would have been nice to see characters in recovery wearing slightly brighter clothes to signify hope for change, or one suffering wearing baggier and darker clothing to show that they are suffering. These changes even could have been subtle and still gone with the aesthetic of the show, which is to be a bit dark and bleak, but this overall opportunity seemed to be missed out on in favor of having them wear their Wawa aesthetic clothing constantly. The second issue I noticed is that the show uses a lot of project placement, such as characters mentioning their coffee is from Wawa or stressing that Mare is and only drinks Rolling Rock beer. I don't think people actually discuss brands this much in real life, and it feels like they are trying too hard to prove that they did research on the area. The last problem that the show has is that of race. The show really only shows black people and white people in the town, and to be quite frank, it often feels like they're showing black people just so they don't get called out on not having representation. But it's important to note that Asian people, Latinx people, and other minorities also live in Pennsylvania. I think this issue of race matters for a few reasons. First, visibility is just generally a good thing. Seeing people like you represented on screen can make you feel more like you belong in your American communities. And secondly, it's also just literally more realistic to depict those minorities living in the town because minorities do live in towns like that. Secondly, I think it would have been interesting to see how the town grapples with race. For example, is there a degree of separation or segregation between people of different races? Are people more reluctant to report incidents to the police even if they see something happen, which could have been an interesting dynamic to explore in a crime procedural? And also things like, for the black characters that are there, do they have extra burdens or pressure on them? For example, is there more pressure on the chief of police there because he has pressure to solve the case as a black man in a position of power in law enforcement? I also think they would have been totally capable of showing these dynamics without also demeaning everyone in that town to be like a stupid, bigoted Trump supporter, which I think is also important, is an important form of representation in these types of shows about blue collar towns. Overall, I still really did like the show. I think the pacing of the show is great and it gave a lot of intrigue to the mystery overall. I think they handled stories of grief and trauma well, and I think they particularly did things like not glamorizing drug addiction and also showed the impact of people around addicts, which I think is something undercovered in a lot of stories. So it might seem like my criticisms are nitpicky, and they probably are, but I still think this form of criticism is good, especially for good shows like Mare of Easttown, because when you produce a good show, the creators have displayed that they have an aptitude to do well. Therefore, noticing their faults can point out how they can use their ability to do better in later shows that they develop, which is a good thing and produces even better shows in the long run.